Good evening. If you'll join me back in Daniel chapter 7, please. Daniel chapter 7. We'll get back into that. Before we begin our study, though, let's pray together. Father, this evening we're thankful again for the opportunity we have to be here together. We're thankful for your word. We're thankful, Father, for all the goodness you provide for us through Christ and through his church. Father, we ask your blessings on us as we study this evening, and we're always mindful of those we love who are having a difficult time. You know what we need, Father, and we ask your blessings on us all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, Daniel chapters 7 through 12, we're grouping them all together because this is the section with the visions and all of that. And so really quickly, just by way of reminder, chapter 7, the four beasts, chapter 8, you can see those things on the screen. That's what we're talking about. We're going to wrap up chapter 7 this evening and maybe do all of chapter 8 if things move really quickly. And so that's the plan. That's kind of what we're looking at. This is what we've talked about so far in chapter 7. We're on that last section, that 15 through 28, where the vision is explained. And so what we'll do is just kind of jump right in there. But like always, if you have a question or a comment, please get my attention and let's talk about it. You may ask me a question in this section that I just cannot answer, and that's okay. If something comes up, let's chat about it. We kind of left off in that section verses 19 through 22. And in Daniel 7, 19 through 22, Daniel is saying he wants to know what the situation is. He wants to understand what this beast is, this one that's hard to describe. It's not like other animals. That's just a terrifying thing. He wants to get a good handle on that and the horn that grew up out of it. And so that's what he says there. And so the response is in verse 23. And this, I want you to think about this from a standpoint of what do we know after he says this? So be thinking about it like that. What do we know after we get an explanation? Because this is the explanation. Then he said, Daniel 7:23, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. Now, he's already said it's going to be a different kingdom. He said that a couple of times, emphasizing that again. It's going to be a different kingdom. It's going to be a fourth kingdom. Now, which kingdom would that be, just counting the major kingdoms? Yeah, real easy for us. All the way back to Daniel chapter 2 and the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had and the way it was explained there, we have no trouble understanding that we're talking about the fourth kingdom. We're talking about the Romans. It's really an easy thing for us to conclude. But that's kind of where the easy for us to conclude comes to an end, because there's a lot of specifics that come into play there that we can guess, but we can't answer. And I'm not much on too much guessing. So anyway, that's what he says. Then he says in verse 24, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. So somebody tell me, who are the 10 kings real quick? Give me 10 kings. Who's the one that's going to come out and subdue? Who are the other 3? Real fast. Come on. Let's go back to the 10 kings. Who are the 10 kings? Where's Butch? Who are the 10 kings? You don't know. Well, if he doesn't know, I don't know. I don't know who the 10 kings are. Now, depending on which commentary you read, you could find a list of 10 kings. You can read another commentary and find another list of 10 kings. You can read another commentary and find another list of 10 kings. The 10 kings are not my concern. The overall picture that's being painted here is the fourth kingdom. And there will be a king in the fourth kingdom that kind of arises and subdues and dominates. Some folks say, well, that has to be Domitian. That's fine. I'm good with that too. It doesn't make me any difference because that's not the focus. The focus is the timing of the empires. And why is the timing of the empires even a discussion? What is the one thing we care about that the timing of the empires has to be in play for? The kingdom that lasts forever. The kingdom that is in power when Christ comes, because that is a significant thing, and the significance has been established already in chapter 2. So when you get to chapter 7 and 8, we don't have to worry about all those other little things that aren't really fully explained, because we know the point in Daniel 2:44. And the point in that section is there's going to be a stone cut out without hands, and that stone is the foundation of a kingdom that endures forever. Do these endure forever, these four that we've talked about? They do not. And by the way, they represent every other earthly kingdom. Surely we see that. They represent the ones before them and the ones after them on earth. They're not going to endure forever. They come and go. But this one that comes during the time of the Roman kings, this is the one that endures forever. And that's why it's so important to get the main point out of Daniel. All of the wrangling and arguing about which king is number 9 in his list of 10, it just doesn't help us with what we're really after. We're establishing the truth that Jesus Christ will come and set up his kingdom that will endure forever during the time of the Roman kings. That's what's going to happen. And that's the thing that matters. But one of the reasons I'm convinced that we have this information about the 10 kings and then 1 king and then 3 other kings, one of the reasons we have that is it really illustrates for us the little point we made back over in verse 2 about the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. One of the things that is impressive about this is that God is telling us that humanity, the great sea of people, humanity is just in a constant churning. There's always one kingdom popping up and another one going away. We don't relate to that like other civilizations and societies have related to that. Here in America, we don't, although we do know our country's pretty young compared to a lot. So, but the whole of the earth is in this constant state of flux, and it's always going to be that way. It's never going to change. Contrast that with what God made in the garden. It was peaceful, and it was very good. No war, no problem, until sin. And from that moment on, the great sea has constantly been stirred up, and kingdoms are coming and kingdoms are going, and that's the way it's going to be. And so God uses that to bring about his eternal kingdom in Christ. The statue in chapter 2, Daniel's vision in chapter 7, his vision in chapter 8, all of that helps us get settled on that major point. These visions do not help us figure out how bad Nero was compared to Domitian. Bad's bad. And we're not going to spend time on that. That's why I say from time to time you can ask questions that we just can't answer. Somebody can try to answer them. That's not what we're going to do here. Speaking of that one in verse 25 that will arise after them, he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. Anybody have a different rendering there? Wear down? Anybody have something different? Wear out. Yeah. What's he going to do? What does that mean? That kingdom and that king is going to do what? Going to create all sorts of problems. It's going to persecute. Yeah, it's going to be hard. And that's a part of the prophecy, and that's a part of the reality. And so he doesn't pull back from that. He says that's the way that's going to be. It's going to be a very difficult thing. But, he says, they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Well, you can imagine what that kind of information generates. And everybody wants to know what we're talking about there. By the way, if you flip over real fast to chapter 12, just real quick over to chapter 12. Run over to chapter 12 and verse 7. We're going to jump right in the middle of something, but that's okay. Chapter 12 and verse 7. I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finished shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. How would you define time, times, and half a time, knowing what you know up to this point?
You're working with guesswork on those, which really has
Do you think God knows our tendencies? Go like this. Do you think He knows what we really want to do? You give me a puzzle to work out that has eternal implications, and what am I going to do? I'm going to try to work that puzzle. I'm going to do it. And the more information you give me, the more I think I can work out that puzzle, right? There are times, though, use that word appropriately, there are times when what God is saying is not going to tell you the detail, but there is a period of time that will go by. Go back in your mind, or literally, to chapter 4 of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar is going to be driven away from mankind. Verse 32, you'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 what will pass? 7 periods of time. Remember, we talked about that. Is that 7 days? Probably not. 7 weeks? No, probably not. 7 months? Could be. 7 years? Maybe so. Do we know? We do not. But what is the qualifier on the 7 periods of time? In that verse, what's the qualifier? What tells us when that 7 periods of time is going to be over? Yeah, when you recognize who God is and respond to Him that way. So the time is not 7 periods of time. That's not our focus. The timing of it all is when Nebuchadnezzar gets to the point where he says, okay, I was wrong. Did God know when that was going to be? Yes, He did. Did He want to tell us the exact number of days that was going to take? No, He did not. We didn't need that information. So that is the principle by which I understand every time we see times, and time and a half, or half a time, or whatever that is, I drop that in the category of, I'm not going to try to figure out exactly how many days that is. Some people do. There's some calculations based on that. And there's also in the Revelation and in Daniel some numbers of days that folks grab a hold of and say, well, there you go, that's got to be it. If you want to do that, that's okay. What He's really after, from my point of view, is it's going to be hard for the Christians. It's going to be hard for God's people for a while. And Rome is going to make it hard. And they're going to have to be faithful. And if that sounds just like the point of the Revelation, then that's good, because that is just the point of the Revelation. It's just being said to Daniel several hundred years prior. But that's what he's after. And then he says in verse 26, but the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever, which is exactly what has happened to every other kingdom, even the ones God put in place and said, this kingdom is there by my will. It's going to go away. And so that has an encouraging aspect to it. If you're thinking down the road and you say, okay, God's people are going to be punished, God's people are going to be, they're going to be decimated, they're going to be persecuted, it's going to be so hard for them, but it's going to come to an end. Which again is the same thing you see in the Revelation. The apocalyptic literature in the text always has a point, and the point always is what? God wins, it's going to be okay, you hang in there, you do what you're supposed to do. That's the task. Don't get distracted by the things of the earth. Don't get distracted trying to run away from the difficulty. Don't get distracted trying to make life easier. You hang in there, because God's going to win, and you want to be on His side when it all comes together. Verse 27, then the sovereignty, dominion, and greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey Him. That's a tough one. It has a little bit of toughness, kind of like in the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We talked about that. And what's our first response to the meek will inherit the earth? What's our first response? Who wants the earth? Why, is that something good? I mean, really? Is that what we want? Well, what he's doing is using a comparative kind of language. And so what he's after is, right now you're subdued, right now you're persecuted, right now things are hard, but there's going to come a time when none of that's going to matter because you're going to be on top. God's team's going to win and you're going to be okay. And the only way we can conjure up goodness is in relationship to this earth. If someone tells you how good heaven's going to be, you have no stick by which to measure for that. You don't know. And so a lot of times it's placed in language like this. So the saints of the highest one are going to be the ones who have sovereignty and dominion and greatness over all the other kingdoms. It doesn't mean that we're going to all sit on big thrones and rule over various aspects of the earth. It just means whatever you know about a kingdom, God's going to put you in one that's even better. That's what He's going to do. You're going to be a part of that. And this is one of those prophecies that gets really personal for us. It needs to. It ought to be personal for us. Because if you look back at verse 27, it'll be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. That's what's going to happen. The people who are serving Him. And that's what you see in the New Testament. The whole idea is the saints are the ones that are the recipients of God's blessings. Here, yes. There, most assuredly. And so you have the same concepts here in Daniel as you have in the gospel. And then Daniel says in verse 28, at this point the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Now, this is where I want you to compare the last verse of chapter 7 with the last verse of chapter 8. Go to chapter 8 and look at the last verse. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. I want you to notice both of those statements at the end of the chapters, they come after an explanation. I want you to think about that. Both those statements come after an explanation of the vision. The first explanation of the vision, Daniel says, my thoughts are alarming me and my face was pale, but I kept it to myself. After the second vision and explanation of the vision, he says, I was astounded at the vision and there was no one to explain it. He just got an explanation. Tell me one thing we can learn from the fact that Daniel, after having received 2 explanations for 2 visions, was still greatly astounded at the visions. Tell me one thing we can learn from that. Yeah, he didn't understand all of it either. I understand that there'll be a 4th kingdom, I understand that, but I don't understand all the detail related to it, and I cannot imagine all of the detail related to it. I honestly can't fathom the amount of detail that is related to the workings of 4 different kingdoms over a 400 or 500 or 600 year period. I cannot imagine the detail that God has arranged and works with to bring all that about. And Daniel's like, okay, I got the explanation, but I am astounded by this. And no one can fill in the gaps for me. If Daniel has that position about his dreams, I would suggest that we might be okay with that position as well. It might be okay. Do you think we have a greater perspective in some ways than Daniel? Well, in one way on the dream itself, maybe not. But what do we have that he didn't have? Yeah, we have hindsight. We're looking at it from a completed record standpoint. We're seeing it, as the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, after that which is perfect has come. We have the completed record. So we can see how it fits together, maybe in ways that maybe he couldn't, but still. So that's chapter 7. Anything about chapter 7 before we jump right into chapter 8, and we're just going to lump it all together? Yes, sir. I think that's a great question, and I would understand that to be all the faithful. I would go where David took us last week, if you remember, to Hebrews chapter 12, and that great assembly. That's what I would say that is. And every time he says that in the context here, I would apply it to that. I would say it is all of the saved, all of those who God says, these are my people, of all time, not just the New Testament church. Yeah, it ramped up slowly, but then it got some momentum. Yeah. Yeah, very well could be. Very well could be. There's so much information and data about that, and I would suggest that if that really is something you want to dive into, that you do that and then come see me and tell me all about it. That's what I would suggest. Because I'm trying to keep the main thing, and that's a challenge for us because, well, we're about to talk about a ram and a goat. If you're using the King James Version, it's a he-goat. What's that? To be a male goat? Yeah, I just called it a goat. So in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, now that's different, right? Okay, so third year of the reign of Belshazzar, Daniel had another vision. It says in verse 2, I looked in the vision. While I was looking, he explains where he was and what was going on. Verse 3, I saw a ram which had two horns standing in front of the canal. Now the two horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one coming up last. And so he sees this ram, and then shortly thereafter, verse 5, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. That is significant, isn't it? What does that tell you if it's coming to cover the whole earth and it's not touching the ground? What does that tell you? What's it trying to paint for you? That it's moving fast? That'd be probably what it's doing. It's kind of gliding right across. It's moving pretty quick. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Well, he goes on to describe how this goat behaves. And how the horns have their place in all of this. Verse 9, one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the beautiful land. That would probably be toward the land of Palestine. If you have a footnote, that's probably what's indicated there. And it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down. That's an interesting thing. What would you say about that? What is that indicating more than likely to you? Was it effective in causing difficulty for God's people? It was. It was effective in causing difficulty. Okay, verse 12, and on account of the transgression of the host, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Well, that's the same concept of he's attacking that which is right, that which is true. He's attacking God's will, God, and God's people. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Okay, that's a lot of reading. Thanks for going through that with me. The emphasis is that this kingdom, it's representing a kingdom. We'll find out who in just a moment, but you already know. But this kingdom is going to do some damage, not merely to God's people physically, but what else? To God's people spiritually, to the sacrifices they offer, to the way they go about serving the Lord. It's going to influence them by philosophy and by power and might and pressure, and it's going to change the way some of them worship, the way some of them relate to God. It will be effective at that. And so then the question, how long is this going to go on? How long are we going to allow this to happen? Because what's happening is the sacrifices, the things we would typically do in service to God, all that's getting muddled up. It's getting messed up. And how long are we going to let that go on? And the answer is 2,300 evenings and mornings. I'll outsource the 2,300 just like I did the time, times, and half a time. Do some research on that and see where you come up. I don't want to don't want to spend the class time on that. So Daniel sees the vision, verse 15, and he's trying to understand it, and there's someone standing before him who looked like a man. Listen to verse 16 now. Read 16 with me. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the river, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So Gabriel's doing the talking. Who is Gabriel? Archangel? Okay. He was told, go explain to Daniel what's going on. So Gabriel comes, Daniel kind of faints. Gabriel says, come on now, let's go. This pertains to the time of the end. Well, are we talking about the day when Jesus returns? Do you think that's the thing we're talking about? Because end time, time of the end, we need to just get a general time frame. Day of Jesus returns, is that what's under consideration? Probably not. Probably talking about the last age, if you will, the last time period, the last, well, one word that we don't use much but has been used for decades is dispensation. The time in which you and I live, or the time of Christ, or the time of the gospel, probably is what the reference is. Because that's the thing that's going to solve the sacrifice issue. That's the thing that's going to bring everybody back together. Because no longer do you have to go to Jerusalem and offer your sacrifice. No longer do you have to go visit a priest in one location and solve your sin problem that way. The gospel says you can do that a different way. You have control over that, not a priest. And so that's probably the reference that he's after there. But it does say in verse 19, the final period of indignation. Anybody have anything different there? I'm sorry? Last end. Okay. From all outward appearances, when God's people, for various reasons, persecution and influence and others, stop acting like God's people, it is a time of indignation. It is a time of, this is not a good situation. And it is a time, ultimately, that causes division amongst God's people. But all of that's going to come to an end, he says. And so he gives him the explanation. Verse 20, one verse on the ram. The ram which you saw with two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, we now know that. Give me a name or two that might help us with that, that's in Daniel. Just Darius the Mede, Cyrus the Great. Okay, so that's what he's talking about there. Okay, he says the ram would be the kings of the Medes and the Persians. And so that's pretty easy for us to understand. Now the shaggy goat says in verse 21, is what the New American Standard calls him. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. Is that pretty straightforward? That's pretty easy, isn't it? Now other things are said about it, but that's pretty easy. And we can understand the kingdom of Greece. Verse 22. Well, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king of Greece. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. Well, now this is where we're interjecting more than just the standard four kingdoms we've always talked about. We've always talked about the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks or Macedonia, and the Romans. What we're doing here is we're inserting some in this slot right here, if I can do it that way. Now, specifically, we're not going to try to enumerate them specifically, but we're talking about kings like the Syrian king, the Seleucid folks. We're even talking about Cleopatra's kingdom in Egypt, that time period of about 330 or so to about 60 BC, in that time frame. And so there's other little smaller kingdoms that's going to come up, and they're going to do some damage. Locally, regionally, they're going to do some real damage. The Syrian kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, centered really from Iran, runs all the way through to Jerusalem and creates some real problems for God's people. And so it's that time frame that he's now zeroing in on. It is the time between Alexander the Great, about 330, 336 BC, and the time of the Roman kingdom, which really began to ramp up just before we turn to AD, from 30 BC on. He's given us some information, and he's saying that time period is going to be rough too. Look at it with me. In the latter, verse 23, in the latter period of time, the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent, skilled in intrigue. His power would be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the evenings and the morning, which has been told, is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. And it was after that that Daniel said for a second time, I was sick and I was amazed and I did not know what all of that meant. So what I want you to see is what God is doing. I'm much more focused on the bigger picture of what God is doing than I am identifying who all of those little kings are. And the reason is because what God is doing is the thing you and I are doing today. We are members of His church, that eternal kingdom of Daniel 2:44 and Daniel 7 and so on. And that's the thing we have to get. So what I want us to do now is I want us to look at some of the kingdoms of which we're aware really quickly. We've got about 4 minutes. So you can see on the map, this is the Egyptian Empire. And this runs, let's see if is there a date on it? Yeah, all the way down to 332 BC. Now, that empire wasn't a monstrous empire the whole time, but that is a major empire from, if you go back to the time of Moses, and you can even go back to Abraham around 2000 BC, but back to the time of Moses around 1445 BC. That's about the time of the Exodus. So that gives you the Egyptian kingdom. And about 1445 is the date we'll use for that. Then we can go to the Assyrians, and you see the date there, about 825 down to, 650 or so. The Assyrians absolutely ruled. Now, what is the root word of Assyria? Syria. So we're talking about the Seleucid people again. We're talking about that Iran arrangement. They were headquartered at Nineveh, and so you can see that on the map there. You can get an idea of their kingdom and the time frame that we're talking about. So we went from the Egyptian kingdom to the Assyrian kingdom. Which one's next? The Babylonian. Babylonian's next. And so that one takes us down to Nebuchadnezzar, 580. That's where Daniel, remember, comes to Babylon. That's what we're talking about right now. Nebuchadnezzar goes away. Some other smaller kings end up taking his place. Nabonidus comes on the scene, not a direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and then it's his son, who's Belshazzar, that is there in the 530, 540 time frame. So you can kind of get that in mind. The next kingdom is the Medes and the Persians. Now, sometimes we don't appreciate the monstrosity of their kingdom. You have Darius the Mede, who is eventually conquered by Cyrus the Persian. You see how the Median kingdom starts, and then you see how the Persian kingdom brought it all together. It was really, really big and really, really powerful. And so when he talks about the Medes and the Persians in verse 20 of chapter 8, it's just one verse, but they ruled a lot of land. But they didn't rule a lot of land for a really, really, really long time, because the guy that came next, Alexander the Great, he did some really amazing things. And he is with the Greek Empire. So you can see some dates there that might be helpful to you, take you all the way down to 323 BC. But let me see, I think I have a different map. Yeah, okay, I know you probably can't see this map real well, but we've got about a minute. I want to show you something here. This is where Jerusalem is, right here. And so you can see the extent to which Alexander the Great in the kingdom went over there, all the way to India over there. But I want you to understand where he started from. This is Macedon here. So he comes out of Macedon, makes his way down through here, over into Egypt, and then makes his way back up and over and does all of his business. He was king for a short period of time, but man, he moved a lot. And he conquered an awful lot. He moved very quickly, and he intended to dominate. I think he was 20 when he became ruler, took over for his father Philip II, I think, and maybe died when he was in his mid-30s, something like that. So he didn't live long, but he ran hard, and that's how he built that kingdom. But when you build one that fast like that, and you're all spread out, it's awful hard to hang on to it. And so that's kind of what happened. When you go to the next kingdom, I thought I had a different map there, but I guess I don't. So going back to this one, all of this land out here to the east, to my right, your right, that is the part that first started going back to these other kings that he's talking about here with the goat and the horns. The Iranian area, the Syrian folks, and all of it kind of began to fall apart in the, I guess the time frame going down to about 175 BC. And then you go down through the Seleucid kingdom and Egypt becomes a power again. You have Cleopatra there in Egypt. And when Cleopatra and Mark Antony and Octavian get into that mess, where we end up with no more Cleopatra and no more Mark Antony, and Octavian wins the battle, and Octavian is Roman. And so that's the beginning of Rome, and that's kind of how that works. So you can see how much area Rome had. Now, Rome had it for a pretty good while. They were dominant for a pretty good while. So that takes us through chapter 8, and what we've really solidified for ourselves is God is explaining how it's going to go, because he already knows how it's going to go, because he's involved in that whole process. And his message to his people is, you do what's right. You do what you're supposed to do. Daniel, you be faithful. And that's the same message for us today. Thank you so much for participating.